If you're from the Caribbean, you've probably heard about the native tribes of the region. Names like Taíno, Kalinago, maybe Arawak or Carib. Maybe you know exactly where all of these people lived and what lands they're tied to. Or maybe you're more like me and you've been somewhat confused. Well, I've decided to figure it out because my head was spinning at some point. So this episode of Caribbean Chronicles is not a story. It's me helping myself understand the lay of the land and inviting you to come along. But before we dive into it, let's talk about why it actually got so confusing. Just a short detour, but an important one. When Columbus arrives in 1492, his Taíno hosts welcome him. They feed him and they try to communicate with him and tell him about the world he's landed in, about their neighbors to the south, about those they know and have relationships with. They tell him a name, something that probably sounded like Cariba. Now, Columbus needs his reports to be dramatic, so the people called Caniba become something much darker in his telling of it. According to him, they're raiders with the faces of dogs, men who eat their men. He calls them the Caribe, and from Caribe comes canibal or cannibal. Yes, the word cannibal comes from Columbus, and it emerged from his misinterpretation of a name a Taíno host shared with him and from the deliberate choice to amplify that misinterpretation into something that justified all that came next. By 1503, Queen Isabella of Spain had signed a decree. Indigenous people in the Americas cannot broadly be enslaved, except for one group, a people called cannibals, who can be captured and sold if they resist or refuse Christianity. Now, nobody's checking who is actually one of the cannibals or not. If a colonist needs land or labor, or simply needs a group of people to disappear, all they have to do is write cannibal in the right box and they're good to go. The entire region full of distinct peoples, the people we're about to name, gets sorted into two categories: the ones you can trade with and the ones you can own. But I'm sure you can see that most of that distinction is arbitrary and based on what the Spanish need for it to be. Let me be clear before we really begin. This is not every rock and reef in the Caribbean. It is the main inhabited islands and the places where people built lives, gave names, and left a mark before anyone arrived to rename them. So let's go. We start at the Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos. The people here were the Lucayans. They were part of the broader Taíno world, and so the same cultural and linguistic family that stretched across the northern Caribbean. They were the first Caribbean people Columbus encountered in 1492, and they were among the first to disappear entirely within a few decades of that encounter. And then there's Cuba, the largest island in the Caribbean and home to more than one people. The Taíno lived here across most of the island. In the center and western parts, Spanish sources refer to the people they called Siboney. But this is where the labeling problem starts, because Siboney was not the name those people used for themselves. It was a Taíno word meaning something like people of the caves applied to them by their neighbors. Today, many historians believe they were likely part of the wider Taíno world and not a separate people at all, just Taíno communities that were given a different label. We're just getting started and already we're getting a bit lost, but let's keep going anyway. So in the far west of Cuba, there were the Guanahatabe, an older, more isolated people distinct from the Taíno. Onto Hispaniola, the island that today holds both Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and which its people called Quisqueya, which is often interpreted as Mother of All Lands. And they also called it Haiti, meaning Land of High Mountains. Both names survived. Haiti kept one, obviously, and the other one became a word of pride in the Dominican Republic. And yes, it was Taíno territory, but it was also home to the Sigayo in the northeast who spoke a different language entirely. and to the Marcorish in parts of the north and center, who were also linguistically distinct. On to Puerto Rico, which its people called Boriquen, and which was also Taíno territory. The name Boriquen is often interpreted as land of the valiant and noble lord. You still hear that name today in the word Boricua. And just off the coast, on the island of Vieques, which its people called Bique, meaning small island, was also Taíno territory. Then Jamaica, which its people called Jamaica, and which means land of wood and water. That is also Taíno territory, and it was heavily populated at first contact. Now we move into a chain of smaller islands that curve southeast from Puerto Rico. And this is where things get more layered, because this chain is where two distinct worlds met and sometimes overlapped. The Virgin Islands, St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix are recorded in some contested sources as Ai, meaning the river. This was borderland territory where Taíno presence from the north met Kalinago presence moving up from the south. Okay, please forgive me so far, but definitely going forward for my pronunciation. But let's try. We're at Anguilla, which its people called Maliuana, a mythical arrow-shaped sea serpent, and St. Martin, called Sualiga, land of salt, and St. Bart's, known in some sources as Uanalau, toad on top. Saba, recorded in some sources as Sima Amonhana, the rock, and St. Eustatius, Aloy, which means cashew island. Now, these small leeward islands sat in that same in-between zone with earlier Arawakan-speaking communities and, by the time Europeans arrived, Kalinago presence and influence as well. The names we have for these islands come from a mix of oral tradition and colonial records, and not all of them are equally certain. But they are what survived. Okay, next is St. Kitts, called Liamuiga, which means fertile land. Then there's Nevis, Owali, land of beautiful water, Antigua, Wadadli, land of fish oil, Barbuda, Waomoni, land of the herons, and Montserrat, Aliuagana, land of the prickly bush. On these islands, Arawakan-speaking people lived for centuries, part of the migration that moved up the island chain from South America. By the time the Europeans arrived, Kalinago presence had reached these islands as well, so that by the time of contact, the picture here, like in much of the leeward chain, was very layered. This is where we move into the heart of the Kalinago world. This is the people Europeans called Caribs, the people the colonial system decided to make into monsters because it was useful to have monsters. The Kalinago originally came from the South American mainland. They were skilled seafarers and fierce defenders of their territory, and they are not gone. Now, so far, the Caribbean has been mostly one linguistic world. Arawakan languages related to each other the way Portuguese and Spanish are related, spreading up the island chain from South America. But there was a second, entirely separate language family also coming out of South America: Cariban. Before the Kalinago arrived, these islands were home to the Igneri, Arawakan-speaking people who lived across the windward chain for centuries. Now remember, the Kalinago came from a Cariban-speaking world on the South American mainland. So when they settled in the Lesser Antilles, you would expect their language to be Cariban, but it wasn't. The language the Kalinago ended up speaking was largely Arawakan at its core, with Cariban elements layered on top. Which means somehow the language of the Igneri survived and became the foundation of the Kalinago language. Okay, now Guadeloupe, which the Kalinago called Caruquera, the island of beautiful waters, and Dominica, Wai Tucubuli, which translates to tall is her body. Then there's Martinique, or Juanacera, island of iguanas, and St. Lucia, Hewanora, there where the iguanas are found. St. Vincent, called Yulumain by the Kalinago in honor of Yuluka, the spirit of the rainbows who they believed inhabited the island, also called Hairuna, land of the blessed, and Grenada, Kamerhoini, whose meaning has not survived clearly but is thought to be land of abundance. I'm sure I'm fully butchering that pronunciation. Bear with me, please. By the time of the European invasion, this chain was the core of Kalinago power, the place where that power was deepest and where resistance to European colonization lasted the longest. Next is Barbados, known to its people as Ishiruganaim, red land with white teeth, the teeth being the reefs. And here we find another gap. Arawakan-speaking people lived on Barbados for centuries, and later Kalinago communities. And then, by the time the English arrived in 1625, the island was empty. Nobody was there. Why exactly? Nobody knows for certain. Disease carried by earlier undocumented European contact is one theory. Slave raids are another, but we just don't really know. Next, we have Trinidad, which the Kalinago called Kairi, land of the hummingbird, and Tobago, called Urupina by the Kalina, which means the big snail, and Alubaera by the Kalinago, land of the spirits. Now, the Kalina were the mainland Caribs living along the South American coast, from whom the Kalinago are believed to be descended. Are you still following? Colonial sources at contact record at least 8 different groups on Trinidad alone, belonging to 3 separate language families. Those sources are fragmentary, spellings vary, and some names may refer to overlapping groups, locations, or colonial classifications rather than to clearly distinct peoples. But with that caveat clearly on the table, this is them. The Nepoya and the Supoya, Arawakan-speaking peoples who farmed the land and built organized communities. The Arawak and the Shebaio, also recorded as Arawakan-speaking. The Chaguanes and groups identified in sources as Warao-speaking, speakers of a language entirely distinct from both Arawakan and Cariban, which is, by the way, still spoken today. And the Nepuyo, Karinepagoto, Yao, and Kalina recorded as Cariban speaking. Tobago, smaller and separate, was home primarily to the Kalina, though whether these were the same Kalinago of the island chain or a distinct mainland branch is still debated in the scholarship. And then there are 3 islands that don't fit into any of the above at all, because the people who lived there came from a completely different place and had a completely different history. Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire. The people here were the Kaiketio, and they were not Taíno, not Kalinago. They migrated from the northwestern coast of Venezuela from around Lake Maracaibo and the Paraguaná Peninsula. The Kaiketio and the Taíno were both Arawakan-speaking peoples, which means they share a very distant common ancestry in the same way as I said that Spanish and Romanian are both Romance languages. They're related, but they're not the same thing, and definitely not the same people. 19th century colonial sources claim that the last person they identified as pure Kaiketio on these islands died in the 1800s, but that is colonial record-keeping at best. Kaiketio ancestry continues among the people of Aruba and Bonaire today, and traces of the Kaiketio language survive in Papiamento spoken across all 3 islands. So this is who was there, not just Arawaks and Caribs. The Lucayans, the Taíno, the people the Spanish sources called Siboney, the Guanahatabe, the Siguayo, and the Marcurish. The Igniri, the Kalinago, the Nepoya, the Supoya, the Arawak, and the Shebayo, the Chaguanes and the Warawitu, the Nepuyo, Karinepagoto, Yao, and Kalina, and the Kaiketio. They were distinct peoples on distinct islands with distinct names and distinct cultures. Throughout this series, as we tell the stories of these islands one by one, we will keep returning to these names. And when we do, you will now know better who I'm talking about. Remember, these people were there long before anyone arrived to rename them as they pleased, and they should not be forgotten.